I had shared a Facebook post about when my grandmother was killed by a drunk driver, and from that, I got challenged to write my story down and share it.
Hello, friends. This is Susan Shull, your host for the Clean Heart Club podcast. I'm a farm wife, mom, Grammy, holy yoga teacher, and Christian life coach. Clean Heart Club is the place for you if you want to learn to live in abundance and walk in freedom to be 100% your true self. I can't wait to share with you guided meditations and sacred story interviews with some of my favorite people. Wherever you are on your path, I'm excited to join hands as we allow our loving Heavenly Father to clean up our hearts and we start living the adventure of our lives with joy and gratitude. This is going to be fun. Welcome, Clean Heart Club listeners, to this episode of the Clean Heart Club podcast. I'm so glad that you are here, and I want to thank you again for listening. I appreciate it, and I love hearing people's stories. So I'm really excited today to introduce you to our guest today, Cathy Brooks, who I met through an encounter group that I lead. Cathy lives in Alaska. So we're going to learn all about what it's like to be a believer, a woman in Alaska. Welcome, Cathy.
Thank you.
We're so glad that you're here. Tell us a little bit about yourself. I think there might be a little bit of delay between my words and your hearing. So we'll just go ahead and just work with that and see what happens. So anyway, tell our listeners about you.
Well, that's a loaded question, right? Like where to start. When you're 20, you can cover the whole gamut, but so I currently live in Fairbanks, Alaska. I was born and raised in rural Pennsylvania in a small town up near Lake Erie, near the border of Ohio. It was a farm, a dairy farm. I was raised on a dairy farm with the typical, get up in the mornings, work hard, siblings, all the things, right? Like family was a really important aspect. I left, though. I always knew, even as a young person, like that wasn't where I was supposed to be. Like this was where, my roots were, but it wasn't where I was supposed to be. And I left and went to college at Penn State University, go PSU. And
so you're a smart
and
cookie.
from there, I connected with some folks that ran sled dogs, of all things. There was actually or still is, a Pennsylvania Sled Dog Club, right? And it was just this unique thing, right? And just became friends, more than anything. And so when I left school, I finished my degree. I had interviewed, and I ended up, through a conversation of somebody I met through that, I had asked them, I said, well, where would you go if you didn't have, your family and your business and stuff? Where would you go with your sled dog if you could go anywhere in the world? And without hesitation, he said, Fairbanks, Alaska. And so it just planted this seed, and that's what I did. I packed up my Ford Escort and my dog and my belongings and drove up and got here in the early 90s, and eventually met and married my husband. And then that just started this adventure. 30 plus years of just living out, for what most people would consider wilderness in the middle of nowhere, to eventually leading us back to Fairbanks, minus all the dogs, except for a few. and then I ended up back at the university and taught for 15 plus years, and just recently left the university from the teaching and currently work for the state as a local government specialist. But there's just so many stories in there. Like, I trying to pick highlights is tough.
Well, maybe I can help you pick out some. So, what did your parents think when you came to them and said, I'm moving to Alaska?
I am sure they were a little bit shocked. And I know that there was a lot more they wanted to say to me than they did. Um, and that is one thing I will always be so grateful. God really did bless me with my parents. I think my dad said more than my mom, which is totally the opposite of our childhood. Um, he worried about my car and getting it all ready, and things that I'm grateful for that he thought of, asked questions about. And I know it was really hard on my mom thinking about me leaving, but she never made me feel guilty. She, I had, after I got up here, I had many, many friends that would say every day they got asked, when are you coming home? When are you coming home? And you know what? My parents never did that to me. They never, and I know that is only through the grace of God that, that she didn't. As I know they worried. I mean, that was back before cell phones. I mean, just even the drive up, that was back when the Alcon, um, like through Canada, you actually drove right where they were doing construction. Like, there wasn't any like stop and wait. You like were driving with the construction
Oh
big.
my
I mean, I can
goodness.
remember looking up and seeing the wheels. And yeah, it was a much different time than it is now.
Did it take you to drive to Alaska from Pennsylvania?
I want to say back then it took me about a week, but it's because, and that's where the sled dog connections, there were different mushers along the way and friends of friends. So they gave me places to stay. I think the only place that I had a hotel was um, maybe Whitehorse and Toke. And by then it was an early snow that year. And so I had to stop in Toke and get my winter tires put on because there was just so much snow.
Were you in Canada? Is Tok in Canada or Alaska?
Toka is just over the border. It's the first sort of major town into Alaska. And that was one of the things that really, I can remember when I got to the border, just having this overwhelming sense or feeling that I was home. Like, this was home. Um, didn't make any sense to a 20-something-year-old
Had
at
you been
all.
to Alaska
But
before?
I just remembered, no, I had never been to Alaska. I was a farm kid. We might have done one weekend out of the year when my brother was finally old enough to milk cows. And we drove to my aunt and uncle's in Cincinnati, Ohio. They had a pool. And so we got to swim in the pool. But that was maybe one other time we took a vacation. We didn't do vacations as a farm family.
So that makes you realize that God really did plant that in your heart.
Yeah, well, like, he was leading, right? Like, he was leading, yeah, because like I said, there were just I felt I was home, and I didn't
Yeah.
know why.
Who knew that there were mushers in the United States? I had no idea.
Oh yeah, they're not nowadays. Their numbers aren't as high because it's such an expensive sport to feed the dogs and so forth. But there was a really active mushing community within especially within the like, Maine down through, I would say, Pennsylvania, because you needed, snow
Get snow.
regularly, right? And then Michigan and Minnesota was full of mushers back in the day, Colorado. Um, but so there were definitely pockets of mushers.
So did you actually go out on trail? What do you call it when you go out with your sled dogs?
Well, so there's racing and then there's training and exploring. And back there, because obviously the time of the amount of snow, they would use wheeled carts, which they called gigs, so you gig raced, or, they had various carts. And in fact, they have mushing in Australia. I mean, it's around the world, but a lot of them have adapted to different, bike joring is super popular, ski joring. So it's just modified versions of it.
Fascinating. Okay, so you said you had a dog. Was your dog a sled dog, a husky, or?
Yeah, so so I was in grad school, and the friend that I connected with, who had sled dogs, um, he ended up giving me one of his dogs. And so yeah, the her name was Brown Bear, and she got the passenger seat and I got the driver's seat,
Oh
and
my
there
goodness.
wasn't a
Okay,
stitch of room.
so you're a newly graduated girl traveling in a car alone to Alaska. Did you know anyone in Alaska, or did you have a job, or how did that work?
So the friend that had given me the sled dog, he had made sure I connected. He had a friend in one of the communities that I drove through, and so I stopped and met him and just made connections there. But yes, the gentleman that I had asked the question about, he owned a dog food business, Animate Pet Food, and he connected me with a friend who was a researcher in Alaska, in the Fairbanks area, that he knew needed what was called a handler, which is like farm help, right? Except they call it a handler with the dogs. And so they had a small apartment over their garage, and so that's where I started. And then eventually, through one of my professors back at Penn State, he knew a professor at UAF, the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and I got, after the winter, that first winter mushing, I connected with him and actually got a job at the university. Um, and then, I set off on my own. I just did that one winter with the researcher and his family.
Okay. So we went to Alaska. We did the land and cruise tour. So I know enough about Alaska to be very dangerous, probably. So Alaska is beautiful. I I feel like you are like a pioneer woman to have done this and not have known. What was the most surprising thing to you about Alaska? But before you answer that question, How much snow was there when you got there, when you had an early snow season?
Well, that year, so I came up right after Labor Day, so it was early September, and it was early, but they had gotten, depending on where you were at, they had already gotten a foot to 2 feet of snow, and it was early, and so there were a lot of trees that were bent over because the sap hadn't, receded yet, and so I was ignorant. I didn't know. And I mean, electricity had been out. The family that I um, worked for, they hadn't had electricity in over a week because there had been so many trees that had taken the power lines out. But in the interior, um, we get a fair bit of snow, but not as much as like a little farther south of us. They actually get more snow, but it melts, down some. When we get the snow, it tends to stay because the temperatures are a little bit colder. So, once there reaches a point, once the snow comes, it stays, and we don't
Is there
have the
still
melt off
is there
that
still
it's used
snow
to.
now, or has it melted?
So I can look out the window and we still have patches, but it has actually warmed up. We're having a pretty warm spring, and so breakup is happening right now, but we've been pretty lucky. It's not been bad.
So, what was the most surprising thing to you when you moved to Alaska?
The light change, so like now it's the lights coming, and it'll essentially be like daylight all the time, but it's the switch back like in November and December. I would say the hardest time is actually probably January, February, after the holidays. So there's a busyness that happens, but that darkness, and someone, and I wish I could remember who, but someone very early on told me the secret to getting through that darkness was to be active, to get outside, be active, even if it's just a little bit, a little bit out of your day, but make yourself get outside. And I had to learn how to deal with some of the extreme cold. Like I had never, or at least I didn't remember, 40 below, 50 below, 60 below. I didn't, if we had that when I was a child, I don't remember it because I'm sure I wasn't allowed outside if it was that cold back then.
Right.
Where here, 20, 30 below is a normal thing, and you just learn how to deal with it, what to look for with your vehicle, how to be prepared, how to dress, those kinds of things.
Goodness, I can't imagine. Have you read The Great Alone by Kristen Hanna?
I'm aware of it, and I may have read parts of it or maybe even read it way back, but it's not fresh in my mind
Yeah.
right at the moment.
Well, I read that after we got back from Alaska, and of course, it's fiction, but The Great Alone, she talked about the main character being lonely. Is loneliness an
Hmm.
issue up there?
It can be because you can isolate yourself, like it gets cold and you don't want to go out, you don't want to um uh it's easier to just stay home, right? And but um isolation can absolutely be a really challenging thing, and that's in one of the stories that I share. We had moved out. So initially when I was first married, we lived in Fairbanks. We had my husband already had sled dogs, and so we had a kennel, but where we were at, he was training for longer distances, and it was getting more dangerous because the number of people and traffic and things were increasing in our area, and so it was getting dangerous for him to train with the traffic, and so we were friends with Dave Munson and Susan Butcher, and they had a second cabin um, out in Eureka, Alaska, and so we moved out there, and um, I had a we had a 2-year-old and a newborn baby, and maybe 25 dogs, give or take. And I had grown up working hard on a farm, being resourceful, all of that. But it was a new level. Like I like living without running water and electricity, because of course with dairy cows you always had electricity, right? Because we needed to milk the cows. Um, and so it was a whole learning curve. But I think the biggest thing was the isolation, being a young mom with just 2 little ones, because my husband would be gone either out training the dogs for long distances, or he was literally gone for work. At the beginning of the year, he would work on the North Slope, and so he would be gone for days, and that was a huge learning curve. I was very blessed that his grandparents lived, I think about 20, but we're talking 20 miles by, not a main road. It was just a dirt road back then, and it felt pretty isolated and in the middle of the wilderness, right? To most
Freezing
people, I
cold.
mean, and it was. I mean, we had, I can remember as the first time I experienced. I'd never seen a wolverine before. I'd never seen, bear tracks, like, grizzly tracks, right? Like um, the Northern Lights, like I will say that was the first time, because you're out in the middle of nowhere. So there's no lights of the city that compete with the Northern Lights. And so I can remember going out to shut off the generator that we had, and the whole sky, like the whole sky was just these brilliant colors. And I could hear this sound, and I'm like, where's it coming from? Because everything was quiet, right? I had shut the generator off, and the house was, everything was quiet, and I could hear this sound. And I remember going to the cabin and saying, Raimi, what am I hearing? What am I hearing? And he's like, no big deal. Like, it's just the Northern Lights. What do you,
They make sound?
and it just, it's, yeah, such, when you are out where there's no interference of city noise and town noise. And it's, sort of like a crackling. It's hard to explain, but you felt like you could almost reach up and just touch them, right? And
Right.
uh, the whole sky, the whole sky. And so there were experiences like that that will stay with me forever. I mean, to the day I die.
Goodness. Oh my goodness. So we should probably back up a second and tell everybody that you have written a book called Sirens. You want to hold it up so they can see it? And we'll put links in the show notes. What led to your writing your book? Because you need to read this book. It's fascinating. And I just want to say, Cathy, I hope book number 2 is about living in Alaska. If I could boss you
Well,
around.
definitely, yeah. Um, so, the book is about how we all go through hard times, um, and sometimes we don't deal with it, right? And I tried to make sure that I offered tools and resources for dealing with that. And I used different stories throughout my life, though some of those hard times to give different examples of what a hard time might look like or be like in hopes that I could connect with people. Um, as a young person, like I've always loved to write. There were definitely um, it was an important part of just my growing up and who I was, like journaling and keeping, and we'd moved several times once we moved back to town. And every time I moved this box that had a bunch of notes and journals, and one day I started pulling them out and I was looking at some of them and I realized a couple of things. I realized how much pain I had processed, but I also realized how faithful God was to me too, right? Like there was always that other side. There was always that person or situation that helped me get to that other side when maybe some people might not have gotten there, right? Without those things. And so I'd been teaching at the university, and I often found students would come to me and share difficult stories, and we'd talk through what they might be able to do or resources. And one day a student asked me, how do you know so much about getting through difficult, like these hard things? And I remember just pausing and thinking because life has been teaching me almost from the get-go, right? A farm life is not an easy life.
Mhm.
The weather dictates and you have no control of it. And I can remember my mom even making a comment, we can only control what we can control. And there's a whole lot more that we don't control. And I think I just sort of carried that through into a lot of the experiences that I had. And so I sat down and thought about what stories, but I can remember asking God before like, what should I share? And literally just sort of thinking through my life. With the exception, I will say that a lot of this came about. I had shared a Facebook post about when my grandmother was killed by a drunk driver. And from that, I got challenged to write my story down and share it. So there's a safe drivers panel up here that shares with folks every month. And that was sort of the beginning. Like I wrote that story first and wrote that down and shared it. And then was challenged, well, what other stories might be out there that could give people some hope or resources that they might need?
So you kind of, excuse me, kind of answered this, but I'll just ask it again. Why should someone read your book?
I hope they read it because they realize that their story and healing matters, and that we all of us go through hard times. They look different. Many of mine are based in Alaska, but we all go through hard times, and many of us were brought up to just shove it down in, and not deal with, just keep going, like, pull your bootstraps up and keep going. And there's a time and a place for that, but there's also a time and a place for pausing and reflecting on how this impacted us and how it may be impacting the people we love, right? And figuring out whether this is something I need to deal with, like, and process, or is this just something I can let go, right? Like, not everything is meant to be processed, but there are some things that we are the better for by pausing and processing it through.
So good and so true. So true. Um, and you've mentioned God's heart in your story. What's it like to be a believer in Alaska? How's the church in Alaska?
That's a mixed question. Like, that is a loaded question, actually, because the church did a lot of damage.
Oh, tell us more.
So what happened, back when Sheldon Jackson was appointed the territorial education, I don't know, governor or whatever, and he brought in a wave of boarding schools because they were going to, you know, save the man by, you know, deleting the savage out of the natives, right?
What year would
And
this have been?
so it it would have been, so it was, we got bought, the territory got bought, and so it would have been in the 1800s, like 1860s, but then, um, Alaska's huge, right? And so what they did is Sheldon realized, hey, the whatever church he belonged to, we couldn't, they couldn't conquer it themselves, and so they divvied up the state of Alaska into different religious areas and said, this church can have this section, this church can have this section. So the Catholics, the Episcopalians, Russian Orthodox, like, they all got sort of assigned different sections of Alaska, which then honestly impacted the amount of damage that was done by some of the boarding schools, and how, because they took away the right, like, languages, dancing, a lot of their cultural practices were deemed evil, and so they weren't allowed to speak their language, they weren't allowed to celebrate their culture, but there were pockets where, thankfully God sent true hearted Christians where they led with love, not with the idea that these were, people to be saved in how they lived, right? Like, there's a difference between saving someone's heart and helping them know Christ than saving the person because they don't wear clothes, like, sewn clothes. They're wearing, um, skins, and, you know, um, practicing, dancing that must be of the devil, right? So
Right.
but there was this, difference in how different regions. So depending on the area, how that, was done, and so it started with it. So there's a lot of anger, in from certain, but having said that, um, some of our churches are just thriving right now because the recognition and saying, "Hey, that was wrong. that was not what Christ would ever have intended to happen to
Mhm.
you, and it was wrong. But here's here's what he is about and what he can do for you. And so here in I mean, um, our churches in Fairbanks are we have several that are booming and thriving. Um, but it's because I think because they're coming from the right place and the right heart and helping people heal, right? Because the historical trauma in our state is immense. And so there's a lot to that.
So did your husband's a native?
So he's was raised in the interior and part Athabascan and part Yupik, or there's um, potentially a Nungan because where his grandmother's mother was, the village is gone now. They wiped out the village, and she was young and essentially moved and raised in a Yupik area. So there's discussion whether Yupik or Anungan, but
And are
his
those Native American
grandfather's side
tribes?
is Athabascan. So we have the different cultural groups. If you looked at Alaska, there's there's mainly 5 main cultural groups that can be broken into. So you have what, a lot of people, call the Eskimo, right? Well, they're Yupik and the Inupiat people, and then down in the interior, it's mainly the Athabascan or Dene people, and then you go farther down and you have the uh, Tlingit and Haida and Shimeon, and then you have the Anungan uh, group. And I hope I didn't forget anybody. Oh, yeah. So within the Athabascan, there's like the Gwich'in um, folks, and that's a huge. It can be broken up, and the same with the Inupiat. There's um, the folks closer to Russia. Um, you have the Chubut people as well. So it's a very, very, very diverse state. Like you have
And
to, when you put Alaska on the map of the United States, like we fill a big portion of it. So all those
almost,
people from Texas, I hate to tell you, but you you're just a drop in our state.
it's almost as big as a third of the United States, isn't it?
Oh yeah, easily. So
Uh-huh.
our borough, which would be counties to a lot of people, it's bigger than the state of it's bigger than the state of Rhode Island. I mean, that's actually we're bigger than a couple of states. And that's just our
Goodness.
county, our borough.
Kathy, I feel like we're just getting started on our conversation. I have a ton more questions myself, but we are working up on an hour already. So I'm going to have you back. Would you be willing to come back?
Yeah, I could do that.
I would love that. Okay, so to kind of tie this up, what do you wish? I forget what Alaskans call the lower 48. There's a term for it. What is it?
Well, we call you the lower 48.
Okay.
Um, and but you might be thinking like when somebody's new to the state, we call them sourdoughs. Because
Interesting.
they got a lot
What
to
do you
learn, right?
wish? What should we know about the people of Alaska that we don't know and that we don't learn when we go on a 7-day Alaskan trip?
I think one of the things to recognize is that, the indigenous people here in Alaska have been here, right? And but our state itself is new. I mean, we're talking 1959, right? So there is um a lot like we're a teenager in many ways in the development of our state. And I'd like to think that we learned from history. But what's the saying? We seem to be destined to repeat it. So, and it's, we are in that growing pains because we have oil, right? And so there's the development side of things, but there's also this desire to not a clashing because there's a desire to allow people to live like they've lived for generations, right? And so it brings this really interesting dynamic, and you throw in suburbia folks that moved up here that enjoy the wilderness, biking, hiking, all of those things, but you still have people truly living off the land, and that subsistence is so very important to them. But you also understand we have to have an economy too, right? And so it just makes for, I guess what I would say is I caution you to believe everything the first Alaskan you talk to says, because there's going to be a lot of different perspectives. Um, and some of them just love to tell you guys stories.
Oh my
Some of
goodness,
it's
that's
true, some of
fascinating.
it might be a little bit.
It's fascinating. Okay, let's end with this question. And so, listeners, why don't you, if you have questions for Cathy, questions about Alaska, questions about what it's like to live in the wilderness, and I'll just say, when we were there, we stayed in, I forget the name of the hotel, but it was down the street from the Nordstrom. And I wanted to go to that Nordstrom so badly because I wanted to see what the fashion was in Alaska, but we did not have time. So if you are interested in Alaskan fashion like me, send me your questions and I will send them to Cathy for our next little chat. Okay, so listen with this question. What is something you're leaving behind? And I didn't tell you I was going to ask you this. So you may, if you want to just say, I need to think about this, that's fine too. What's something you're leaving behind and something that you're taking with you? It's a deep question.
It is. I mean, ultimately, obviously, I'm leaving behind my words by writing the book. I am leaving behind the words that I've chosen. And as far as taking with me, I would say memories, right? And the love and the family. What else can you, right? What else can you take with you? Because you can't take the stuff or the belongings, right?
Mm. So good. So good. Thank you, Cathy, for joining me. And I want to encourage you all to check out Cathy's book, Sirens. They can order it on Amazon. I don't know if it's available at other places too, but I know you can get it.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And we do have a website, www.write22, like the writing, WRITE, the number 22.com. And there's links from that because like the earrings that I'm wearing, my
Talk to you about
husband
that too.
makes jewelry. Yeah. So we did it. We have a combination website there.
So, and we'll include links to all that in the show notes so you guys can check that out. And Cathy, thank you so much for joining me. This was fascinating and just the tip of the iceberg of my questions. So I look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Clean Heart Club podcast. I hope that you were blessed and learned some things that will help you on your journey. Let's remember this truth from Psalm 28:7. The Lord is my strength and shield. I trust him with all my heart. He helps me, and my heart is filled with joy. I burst out in songs of thanksgiving. Did you know I wrote a course for you? It's called the Clean Heart Club and contains 10 video teachings about some of my favorite life coaching concepts, which are so helpful. You're also invited to come join the fun in the Clean Heart Club group on Facebook and sign up to receive my weekly newsletter of encouragement. Let's be friends. See you next time.